This talk is going to be about the flood of rights or claims or images, this time more in relation to spectatorship. Specifically about a certain model of spectatorship that was advanced by a few films in the 70s, but most specifically this one, The Parallax View, directed by Alan Pakula. It's based on a book, not this book. Instead, the book by Lauren Singer, which is a tidy, taut, and stylish thriller that functions as a political chiller as well. It does indeed have breath-baiting suspense. The story is the story of a journalist named Joe Frady, who uncovers a connection between American political assassinations from between 1959 to 1971, which was roughly our great era of political assassinations. He discovers a connection between these and a shadowy corporation organization known as the Parallax Corporation. And apparently, they're hiring. So our journalist goes undercover and applies for a job hoping to infiltrate this organization. And the first step in the hiring process is for him to fill out an aptitude test. And at some point, he realizes that because the suspicion is that the Parallax Corporation is recruiting assassins for hire, perhaps they're checking for qualities with this test that he doesn't possess, and he won't be able to get any further. So he hires a psychopath to take the test for him. And using this method, he actually gets the job. And he's invited to a final round of screening at the corporate offices. And once he gets to their floor, he's shown a film.
Parallax Corporation's Division of Human Engineering. You will now please cross to the chair. And you will sit down. Make yourself comfortable. And be sure to place each one of your hands on the box on either side of the chair, making sure that each one of your fingers is on one of the white rectangles. Just sit back. Nothing is required of you except to observe the visual materials that are presented to you. Be sure to keep your fingers on the box at all times. All right? We hope you find the test a pleasant experience. Please proceed to our offices. Thank you for your cooperation.
Now, before I go any further with my prepared comments, I just want to give a very reluctant but wholehearted praise to Google image search, which is actually completely astonishing. I was able to source 3/4 of those images just based on fragments and just corners of them. But again, it's reluctant homage. So there is a lot to say about that film. It's a mishmash of cinematic influences from Bruce Conner to third cinema, but perhaps its most important influence was Richard Nixon's 1968 television campaign, which was shot by documentary filmmaker Eugene Jones, and which was, and this was new for commercials, well, relatively new for commercials at the time.
It is the voice of the great majority of Americans, the forgotten Americans, the non-shouters, the
This campaign was based entirely on stills.
They are not racists or sick.
Now, Pakula, the director, has said that the aim of his montage was to, quote, whip you into a frenzy of rage if you are one of the people who feels left out of society, if you are one of the unwanted, one of the unsuccessful. And perhaps Pakula was whipped into such a frenzy by the Nixon campaign. And so he shot a movie-scaled, metastasized version of a Nixon campaign ad featuring stock images, porn images, advertising images, art photography, and crime photography, as well as cropped and full reproductions of war photography by Horst Fass, by W. Eugene Smith, and by Karl Maidens, as well as anonymous images of execution, militarization, and brutalization from Palestine, Japan, and America itself. And Frady, if you could make it out from the audio at the beginning, has his fingers on the arms of the chair, has his arms on the arms of the chair and his fingers on the white rectangles, which are presumably galvanic skin response sensors. Because what they're trying to find out about his response, what they're testing for, is whether or not he's a psychopath. Now, watching that entire sequence, it's very hard to avoid comparisons to Stanley Kubrick's 1971 film, A Clockwork Orange. Here too, our protagonist is made to watch a film. And here too, his somatic response is monitored, although here it seems to be an EEG, or an electroencephalogram. And here too, the content of the film is violence, although the sequences that Alex, the hero of A Clockwork Orange, is made to watch are, in a certain sense, more decorous than what Frady had to watch. The sequences seem to be reenactments and historical military footage. So given the content and given the absence of a flood-inducing montage, the claims of Alex's images feel much less immediate, although his predicament seems infinitely more grotesque. But fundamentally, Frady and Alex are in the same predicament. Alex is a sociopath who is being shown images of violence and suffering in order to be cured of his antisocial tendencies, and thereby reduce the suffering he inflicts upon society. As you may know, he is being pumped full of a drug that will make him associate violence with nausea. Joe Frady, on the other hand, is being shown images of violence and suffering in order to ensure that he's enough of a sociopath to inflict, through targeted killings, even more suffering on society. But in both cases, the subjects in question are sitting alone in a screening room watching a film. And in both cases, what is being measured is their moral fitness. And in both cases, the measure of their moral fitness is their response to the images that they see. And in both cases, their moral fitness is seriously in doubt. And that is a crazy way to look at spectators. It almost makes you long for the days when conformity was the only problem. Now, I want to propose that this vision of spectatorship literalizes certain anxieties about our relationship to the image. What these anxieties were or are depends on the nature of your investment in that relationship. On the most basic level, there's the normal and seemingly eternal human anguish over what our representations actually accomplish. On a more activist humanitarian level, this anxiety becomes more urgent, coupled as it is in the 70s with a more specific anxiety over desensitization that's articulated by thinkers as diverse as Sontag and Warhol. And from the point of view of the filmmakers and the studios in the early 70s, there's anxiety over losing market share to TV rebroadcasts of movies, which leads to the suspicion that anyone who watches movies alone and in private is a psychopath. This is a page from the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It's about, I think it's 500 questions long. I tried administering it to myself, and lo and behold, I found the source of the questionnaire from the parallax view. I got a copy off of a file sharing site, but I can't grade my results because nobody's actually pirated the answer key. And these personality inventories are incredibly closely held, proprietary, and profitable. So as much as Clockwork Orange is understood to be about the triumph of behaviorist psychology, or behaviorism, the parallax view can be understood as a film about the triumph of personality assessment, a science that began, like unfortunately pretty much every technology we will run into, in the military. It originated with the attempt to qualify American pilots in World War I. They needed them in a rush, and they wanted to know who was liable to crash, who was liable to not be able to handle the pressure. So this was one of the early cases of hiring psychologists to come on and work and diagnose people for the military. The Rorschach test, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is another early example of personality assessment, which is basically trying to identify or predict personality traits or responses. But the craft really takes off in America during the post-war attempt to quantify everything, using, in this case, multiple choice tests, and ultimately optical scanners, in order to identify personality types according to 1 million different categories depending on whose proprietary test you're taking. In this case, it's the Myers-Briggs, which will identify you as extroverted, introverted, thinking or feeling, judging or perceiving. Different institutions will purchase the inventory and its decoding scales to diagnose different things, i.e., you can use the Briggs-Myers set of questions in clinical psychology to diagnose whether or not a young child will turn into a sociopath, to diagnose depressive tendencies, future tendencies, but, and this is the most profitable and common use right now, which began in the 70s, and you see this playing itself out in the parallax view, it's mainly used to test job aptitude. And corporations will purchase these things to do pre-screening, post-screening, and in fact, well, I'll get to this. I'll come back to this. So that's the case with personality inventories. Simultaneous with the growth of personality inventories was another form of personality assessment, which were the projective psychological tests, such as the Rosenzweig Picture Frustration Study, where you fill in the blanks, and actually Alex in A Clockwork Orange is subjected to one of these as well by his nurse. And the thematic apperception test, or TAT. This was invented by Harvard psychologists Henry Murray and Christiana Morgan. Now, the reason the Rosenzweig and the thematic apperception tests are called projective tests is that, as opposed to a personality inventory like the MMPI, these tests show you situations and ask you to project yourself into them by telling a story about what is going on in the image. And the reason such projective tests blossomed alongside the personality inventory was that there was a suspicion that the self-reporting of the personality inventory, the MMPI or the Briggs-Myers inventory, that these self-reporting tests were subject to all kinds of distortions or aspirational thinking, i.e., if you have a question that says, I can't stop thinking about my mother, and you're in a testing situation, you don't necessarily want to be the guy who checks yes, because you don't know what would happen. And one could inadvertently game the system, which is exactly what our journalist Joe Frady does deliberately in the parallax view, where he consults with the head of the psychiatric lab to have Ernie, who chopped up his stepmother and killed 2 ticket takers, to take the test for him, and yes, that is a chimp playing an early version of Pong. So the idea behind thematic apperception testing was that simply by telling a story around the images, one could get at a more authentic response because one was, in a sense, outsmarting one's conscious self. Now, meanwhile, the film industry was trying to work around similar problems in its test screenings. They wanted more information from their focus groups so that they could have a better sense of what scenes to fix. And surveys given out after the entire movie simply weren't providing any useful information to them. So, in the 70s, after a period of research in the late 60s, a wave of patent applications start coming in for what will soon become known as dial test audience response systems, which would allow spectators to self-report their reactions to movies in real time. So, even as the psychological testing industry is pushing people towards increasingly cinematic and spectatorial apperceptive testing, the film industry is moving towards increasingly somatized response diagnostics. And the result is ultimately a test screening from hell, where the auditorium becomes a laboratory, and it is no longer the film that is being tested, but the spectator, by increasingly invasive means, and the spectator is being tested for very particular traits. Now, this is a patent application from 1974 for one of the earliest dial test systems. It was approved in '76, called the consensor. I'm not kidding. From a corporation called the Applied Futures Group. What's interesting about this patent application is that on the application, the Applied Futures Group describes it as a voting system, which is, in a sense, what audience response systems are. They're polling mechanisms. And sure enough, Applied Futures was eventually acquired by Comtech, which eventually donated an actual electronic voting system to the Iraqi government, just prior to being acquired by the Fleetwood Group, which is a Christ-centered, employee-owned audience analytics industry. But images of actual violence, as opposed to fictional scenes, seem to demand, by dint of their urgency, a more dualistic response. There's no middle of the dial. There's no mildly agree or disagree, or mildly disagree with images of atrocity. These images seem to demand a yes-no answer, a vote, if you will, in which you either consent to the injustice of which you are a spectator, or you protest, you vote no. And as always, the ne plus ultra of spectatorial revulsion in the face of atrocity is nausea.
Get me up. I want to be sick.
Our characters here are no longer voting with their fingers or their decision making. They're not voting by filling out a sheet. They are voting with their sweat. They're voting with their skin. They're voting with their stomachs.
Saya tahu bahwa saya kerjaan itu salah, tapi saya harus melaksanakannya.
The man you were just watching is named Anwar Congo, and he was, or is, an Indonesian mass murderer. And in this moment, he is reflecting on his own guilt after a kind of perverse reckoning in Josh Oppenheimer's sort of documentary, The Act of Killing. And the way we know that Congo is undergoing an ethical crisis after years spent unrepentant is through his nausea. Throughout the entire film, Congo has been asked to reenact his most famous atrocities as both actor and director, and thus to be both spectator to and victim of his own crimes, positions he was unable to occupy when he was actually perpetrating these crimes. And now, back on the terrace where he committed the bulk of his murders, he experiences, just at the end of the movie, a sort of climactic moment of revulsion. And the gagging is, apparently, how we know something has registered, or at least this is the shorthand that the film uses. And Congo is perhaps a good lead-in to thinking, Anwar Congo, is perhaps a good lead-in to thinking about this issue of spectatorship and the image today. Anwar Congo does not need to be confronted by such a cumbersome spectatorial apparatus as our characters from the 70s. Congo, like all citizens in an information economy, can create his own. The flood no longer needs to be represented by a montage because the spectator is no longer fixed in place. The spectator is now ambulatory, and accordingly we are today beset by a profusion of screens. The speed of uploads is swapped in for the rush of cuts. We're still volunteering to give up information about ourselves by liking, disliking on Facebook, or wearing fitness trackers, or using smart kitchens, just as the earlier protagonists were. And state and corporate apparatuses are still desperate to get under our skin through eye motion tracking or fMRIs and various forms of analytics. But the spectator in relation to these technologies is no longer portrayed the same way. And this is perhaps because of the developments that Eric discussed yesterday. You can get information more quickly. And you can, in fact, manipulate inefficiencies in the system or redundancies in the system to get the information out and act upon it. And the 0.5 seconds of affect remains, for now, unquantifiable, and you can act on it. Or maybe the reason that the spectator is portrayed differently in relation to the flood is that we're now used to living underwater. What I'm trying to say is spectatorship in this era is no longer figured as the kind of active captivity which we began with. Spectatorship is now depicted as either utterly passive, as in The Matrix, where we're all practically vegetables, or we're highly active, but with no stakes at all, as in The Game. In this recap of the parallax view, Michael Douglas volunteers to get tested in his own person.
Confused? Risky.
He does so to participate in a game which turns out to be just a metastasized expression of the experience economy.
Whoops. I put it back until tomorrow.
There are no stakes in this version of the parallax view. There are no assassinations. It's all just a game.
Does this thing end?
So I think a more unusual and maybe productive way of thinking about the flood, about demonstrative urgency and ubiquitous capture, is actually suggested by another film. One, rather than being from the 90s, is from the early aughts, which actually eliminates the spectator. It accomplishes the very strange feat of eliminating the spectator altogether, while strangely eliciting sympathy for the medium itself. This is Douglas Gordon's Domestic, As Long as It Lasts, from 2002. In which he purchased a consumer DV camera, laid it on the ground, and just kicks it until it dies. Thank you.